My name is Tanya Costa, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this interactive webinar titled Understanding E-Cigarettes Use Among Adults. This is part 3 of a 3-part webinar series called Landscape and Emerging Issues with E-Cigarettes. A few quick housekeeping notes before we get started today. In the chat box, participants can type in a question or a comment during the presentation. However, we will reserve some time at the end for a Q&A period. We will record and archive this webinar for future viewing. The link will be sent out along with today's evaluation survey. The full bio for our special guests, a resource sheet, and an evaluation link will be forwarded post-webinar. Now let me introduce Cindy Baker-Burrell. Cindy is the program manager at Simcoe Muskoka Health Unit for the Smoke-Free program, which includes the Central East Tobacco Control Network. Cindy will introduce today's webinar and our special guest speakers, and will be moderating today's question period. Cindy, I'll now turn it over to you to do the land acknowledgements.
Good morning. We recognize that our work and the work of our members takes place on traditional Indigenous territories across Ontario. We also wish to acknowledge that the office of the RNAO is located on the traditional Indigenous territory of Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and most recently the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We also recognize that the participants on today's webinar are located in other traditional lands across Ontario. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this territory. By personally making a land acknowledgement, you are taking part in an act of reconciliation, honoring the land and Indigenous heritage, which dates back over 10,000 years. Hi, I'm Cindy, and on behalf of your hosts, RNAO, Community Health Nurses Initiatives Group, and Community Health Nurses of Canada, I want to welcome you to today's webinar. This webinar is one of the many resources made available by the Ontario Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care. I would now like to introduce our speakers for today's panel, whose full bios will be shared after today's webinar. Rosemary Lamont is a clinical nurse specialist with the York Region Public Health and who has over 35 years of experience and is a longtime RNAO member. She has worked in both the hospital and public health sectors. Her focus has been on mental health, sexual health, adolescent medicine, women's health, substance use, and harm reduction. In her current role, she consults with health and social service sectors to support the development of tobacco control policies, cessation services, and provides training for professionals in tobacco cessation best practices. And thank you, Rosemary, for taking time to participate today, as I know you are very busy with your COVID-19 response at this time. Our second panelist is Dr. Andrew Pipe, who was formerly Chief of the Division of Prevention and Rehabilitation at the University of Ottawa Heart Institute and is a professor in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Ottawa. Dr. Pipe continues his clinical and research activities within the division. He received his MD from Queen's University in Kingston in 1974. Dr. Pipe is Canada's foremost expert on smoking cessation. He was instrumental in the development of the widely adopted Ottawa model for smoking cessation at the Heart Institute, and probably doesn't need an introduction to people signing up today. Over to you, Dr. Pipe.
Well, good morning, and thank you for that very, very generous introduction and for so sensitively pointing out that I graduated from medical school at some point in the last century. Before I begin, I do want to take this opportunity to express my appreciation, and I'm sure the appreciation of countless others, to those of you that are working in public health and have been so actively involved in addressing the challenges of the COVID pandemic. It's rare that one gets an opportunity to directly express that gratitude, and I do want you to know that all of the work that you are doing is deeply appreciated by not only all of your clinical colleagues across the province and elsewhere, but I know very much by the public. I suppose that one of the silver linings of the pandemic cloud may be that the general public and indeed the profession has a far greater appreciation of the value of prevention. And it's in that context that I think today's presentation is most appropriate. And over the course of the next few minutes, I'm going to probably very rapidly, but hopefully somewhat completely address issues that emerge from the current pandemic of vaping behaviors, and also talk about the implications for vaping and smoking cessation. I'm pushing my computer button very aggressively, and absolutely nothing seems to be happening, despite the fact that when we tried this in the warm-up a few minutes ago, everything did work. And so I know that Tanya
Yep, Dr. Pipe, I'm just going to stop your share and we're going to try that again, and it might just fix the problem. Give me one moment.
To err is human. To really mess up, as you all know, takes a computer. And I think we're seeing that reality expressed right now. So I'm in your hands, Tanya. What would you like me to do now?
Why don't you try again and share your screen? At the bottom, it should say screen share. Pull up that icon and then.
There we go.
Perfect.
And I'm pressing my computer buttons, and again, absolutely nothing is happening, despite the fact that I know you have these slides, Tanya. Maybe you could put them up and share your screen, and perhaps that will work.
Absolutely. Give me one moment while I just upload them.
And I will continue to talk while you do that. I'm sure that many of you are aware of the nature of these of the devices that we're talking about today. Many of you, however, may not be aware of the rapidity with which these devices are evolving. This is a very, very rapidly changing field, and the early e-cigarettes, or the Ciga-like kind of devices, which you may have been familiar with, have been superseded by a whole array of products which vary immensely in their ability to deliver various levels of nicotine, plus the thousands of other chemicals which can be part and parcel of the vape, which is produced by these devices as they are used. In particular, it's important to know that now, with the advent of devices known as like Juul or Vype, V-Y-P-E, which are widely available and have captured a very substantial proportion of the vaping market, that these are devices that can deliver phenomenal levels of nicotine, much, much greater levels of nicotine than could ever be delivered by a cigarette. And as a consequence, they tend to cement nicotine addiction. Now, I see that Tanya has got my slides up. If you could advance to the next one, please, Tanya. All of us need no reminder of the fact that smoking cessation is, outside of vaccination, the most important preventive intervention we can deliver in virtually any setting. And the promise of e-devices, or electronic nicotine delivery systems, ENDS, next slide, please, to deliver an opportunity for smoking cessation is one that has strong theoretical consideration, but as you will see, there are a number of significant drawbacks. Slide, please. You will note that all of these devices consist of a solution which is heated to produce a vapor containing nicotine. And as all of you are aware, a vapor which may contain thousands of other chemicals, flavor agents, accelerants, substances which actually make nicotine likely to become even more addictive, et cetera, all of which are inhaled. It's also important to note that there's very little regulation of these devices in Canada as a consequence of, in my view, massive oversight on the part of Health Canada. And while you have to get all kinds of permission to put products or flavors into food, no such permission is required, and there's no regulation of the countless number of chemicals which are added as flavoring agents to these devices. And it's also important to remember that when you inhale anything into the lungs, you immediately deliver it directly to the heart, and thereafter directly throughout the arterial system to every tissue and organ of the body. So it's no wonder that, as we'll see in a moment, there are a number of concerns about the health consequences of the use of these devices. Slide, please. There are a variety of generations. The early Ciga-likes then gave way to the pen-style devices, and then the tank devices, which allow individuals to customize the solution that they heat to produce a vapor. And here it's important to note, as is seen on this slide, that there are elements in these devices which themselves pose significant harm to particularly the respiratory system and other systems as a consequence of the fact that there are metallic, ceramic, and other carcinogenic agents in the devices which give off minute particles of these substances. Slide, please. This is the most sophisticated drug delivery device outside of the implantable pump in our community. And Juul and its other counterparts like Vype have captured a significant proportion of the market. Slide, please. These devices deliver a prodigious amount of nicotine. And back to the slide, please. And each one of these little pods, which is inserted into this device, provides as much nicotine as a package of cigarettes. And it's not unusual for teenagers in many settings to be using 2 or 3 of these pods a day. So they get prodigious quantities of nicotine, as do those smokers who might gravitate to the use of these devices thinking that they will help them stop smoking. More of that later. Next slide, please. These devices use a very sophisticated form of nicotine delivery using nicotine salts. And as a consequence, they're able to deliver levels of nicotine which it would be impossible to deliver from a cigarette, because a cigarette delivering that quantity of nicotine would produce such significant throat irritation that the use of the cigarette in this fashion would not be acceptable. Slide, please. There are also new kids on the block, and many of you may not even be aware of the emergence of a whole class of disposable vaping devices such as the puff bars, which contain a variety of flavored solutions and are intended to be used and then just tossed aside. So it's very, very important to recognize how rapidly this product category is changing. Slide, please. It's also important to understand that there are about 1.5 million vapors in Canada, and look very closely at this data, which is unpublished, but very authoritative, and comes from a source with which I'm very familiar. Of those people who are vapors, approximately 40%, 38% are continuing to smoke. They are what we would call dual users, D-U-A-L. And as a consequence, there's absolutely no reduction in harm represented at all by the adoption of the use of these devices in this way. Approximately a quarter of individuals are former smokers. So these are individuals who are solely using these devices. But staggeringly, 37% of those who use these devices in Canada are people who were never, ever smokers or never intended to be smokers. And as a consequence of the fact that the vast majority of the users of these devices are young adults and teenagers, it's important to recognize the role that these devices have played in developing nicotine addiction in youngsters who never had any intention of smoking. Slide, please. As you are aware, a cigarette contains a whole variety of toxic products, carcinogens, carbon monoxide, et cetera, et cetera. Many of these elements are still present in e-devices. Obviously, there are no products of combustion. And so therefore, from the point of cancer development, these are arguably safer devices. Slide, please. However, and the argument has often been made that therefore these should be seen as very much less harmful products, and therefore we should encourage their particular use. Those kind of calculations politely have been made on the backs of napkins. And so that the degree to which these are less harmful is very much open to question. Although from a cancer development point of view, unquestionably, they are very, very much less harmful. Slide, please. But there are significant health consequences about which we should have some awareness. Slide, please. The evidence continues to emerge that while there's a reduction of cancer risk, and it's important to understand that in 1930s, lung cancer was an exceptionally rare form of cancer. Welcome to 2020, in which we see that lung cancer is one of the leading forms of cancer death in Canada, the leading form of cancer death amongst Canadian women, simply as a consequence of the degree to which smoking is accelerated. Today, interstitial lung disease and fibrotic lung diseases are very, very rare. But we are already beginning to see the features of those diseases in individuals who are vaping. And so are we replacing one epidemic of lung diseases, but with another potential epidemic in long term? Obviously, smoking has a profound impact on cardiovascular risk and attracts a lot of my attention given where I work. But all of the features of cardiovascular development or cardiovascular disease development, platelet aggregation, irritation of the surfaces of blood vessels and arteries, the degree to which the mechanisms of blood vessels and arteries are impaired, what we call flow-mediated dilation, all are there and are produced by the use of these devices. Clearly, once you give individuals huge quantities of nicotine, the addiction potential of these devices can never be overestimated. And remind ourselves that nicotine is arguably the most tenaciously addictive drug that we address in our community. And of course, there's a concern which continues to grow and the evidence just continues to accumulate that the use of these devices is not only a gateway to smoking, but it's also a gateway to other drugs, to the use of other drugs of abuse. Slide, please. So this slide just demonstrates, if you hit this slide just demonstrates the emerging evidence that is appearing in the pathophysiological literature that draws attention to the impact of these devices on lung, brain, heart, etc., health and well-being, and much more is yet to be determined. Now, I want to be quite clear. I believe strongly in the concept of harm reduction. And obviously, harm reduction can play a very important role in helping people move away from drugs of addiction. And we see that best expressed in terms of those who are addicted to opioids and other drugs. But while I believe in harm reduction, I don't believe in making mango peach flavored methadone or Suboxone available in corner stores or gas stations. And I think the degree to which people have drunk the elixir of harm reduction insofar as e-devices is concerned, has obscured a growing body of knowledge that identifies some of the issues which we as clinicians must address. Next slide, please. So here we see that from a cardiovascular perspective, the blue represents cigarettes, the red represents e-devices, and you see really no difference in terms of the impact on flow-mediated dilatation, a measure of vascular health. Slide, please. And we see in this next slide, if you'll hit the button again, please, you'll see that Juul produces the same kind of impact on flow-mediated dilatation, hit the button again, please, as does a Marlboro cigarette. So no real harm reduction potential from a cardiovascular perspective insofar as those parameters are concerned. Next slide, please. You'll also see that there are a whole array of elements and processes which contribute to the pulmonary toxicity of these devices. And obviously today's presentation does not allow us to go into those in great detail, but they're there and they cannot be ignored, and they have implications for all of us, particularly if we are advising the use of these devices to help with smoking cessation. Slide, please. That body of knowledge just continues to accumulate. Slide, please. We'll move more quickly through some of these slides, if I may. Slide, please. And so the other important element to remember is that these devices are now increasingly products of the tobacco industry, and they have absolutely no interest whatsoever in helping people stop smoking. There has not been a single application anywhere in the world, to my knowledge, for registration of these kinds of devices as aids to smoking cessation. And I think that's a very, very powerful indication of the degree to which these devices may not be what we hope them to be in terms of smoking cessation. The tobacco industry views these as another product line which will secure another cohort of nicotine addicted customers, et cetera, et cetera. Slide, please. And the evidence just continues to slide, please. The evidence just continues to accumulate. Slide, if you'll hit it again, please, showing that the likelihood of individuals who have no intention whatsoever to smoke are 5 times more likely to become smokers if they start to use these devices. Slide, please. They're also much more likely to become users of other drugs. And I think this is very startling data, which underpins the necessity for the regulation of these devices. For every adult who stops smoking using these e-cigarettes, 81 teenagers and young adults become addicted to nicotine and may become daily cigarette smokers. That's very chastening. Slide, please. And the pathways into other forms of drug use are also well understood as beginning often with e-cigarette use. Slide, please. So some very significant concerns. Let's remind ourselves that, yeah, there's no smoke or millions of chemicals that are found in cigarettes, but they have high nicotine concentration and the other products which can pose health problems. Slide, please. So let's talk about the use of these devices for smoking cessation. And here there are a couple of very important concepts that we should all understand. Slide, please. When we look at the clinical trial evidence, we see in this forest plot that the evidence favors the use of these devices to help individuals stop smoking. And the way that you look at a forest plot is there's a single vertical line on this chart. And all of those dots that are to the right of that single vertical line indicate that there's an advantage, in this case, smoking cessation, through using these devices. And the dotted red line with the diamond kind of indicates the overall mean of the impact of those studies, which suggests, yes, that these devices can play a role as derived from clinical trial evidence. Next slide, please. On the other hand, when we look at the real world experience, not in a clinical trial setting, but in day-to-day clinical practice, people who report or who are being followed for the use of these devices, we find that there's really no evidence at all. And so that's also, I think, very important for us to understand before we embark necessarily on a wholesale approach to suggesting the use of these devices for smoking cessation. Slide, please. So it's also important for us to consider that there's no approval for the use of these devices in smoking cessation, nor has any been sought. There are no clear clinical protocols. There's very limited evidence, we'll see in a second, of their effectiveness. As a healthcare professional, I think obviously we have to be very careful what kind of products and devices we recommend people to use. We have a professional responsibility to know something about those products. We have a professional responsibility to know something about their safety. And of course, across Canada, there are varying approaches to their regulation. And as always, it's important to appreciate that there's a clear need for more research. And I want to argue emphatically, a clear need for much more appropriate product regulation. Slide, please. These are the results of probably the most cited and the most authoritative trial, which shows in this research that was conducted in the United Kingdom that individuals using e-devices were much more likely to stop smoking than those that were using nicotine replacement therapy. It is important, however, to understand that the results of the e-cigarette arm of this trial are not that startling, and indeed are consistent with the results that one can obtain using standard smoking cessation medications and therapies in order to assist with cessation. Nonetheless, this is a very important study. Slide, please. Slide again, please. Just published a few days ago, the results of the Cochrane report, which has assessed the use of e-devices for smoking cessation. And their conclusion is that more people probably stop smoking for 6 months using these devices than using NRT. But there are only 3 studies in the world that can be used to support that contention. And when compared to nicotine-free cigarettes, 3 studies again, and the numbers of people involved in these studies are very small. So quite clearly, there are reasons to assume that e-devices appropriately regulated and appropriately used can help individuals stop smoking. Is that the situation that we face today in Ontario with the level of regulation of these devices? I don't think so. Slide, please. Slide again, please. So if these devices are to be helpful, slide again, please, we need appropriate regulation, particularly insofar as nicotine content is concerned. The products that are sold in Ontario contain way more nicotine than would be permitted in the United Kingdom or in the European Union or in other countries around the world. We need to regulate what else is in these devices. We need a ban on flavors, and we need to regulate the marketing of these devices in exactly the same way, or at least to closely to the same degree that we do other tobacco products. And it would be helpful if there was approval for the use of these devices as a cessation aid, which will require a manufacturer to apply for such approval. Slide, please. And we need robust research evidence. So what's my wish list? Well, we'd like to have a product of known content and quality, have some evidence of not only the efficacy, the idea that they will work in a clinical trial, but also their effectiveness, the fact that they might work in the general population. We need to have a known protocol or a schema for the use of these devices. These devices need to be easily used by their users. I think that's not a question. We also have to understand that we need the acceptability of these devices as a smoking cessation aid. And in Canada, the emerging data says that smokers aren't interested in the use of these devices because they are concerned about the health consequences. And clinicians, particularly physicians, have no interest in the use of these devices because of their concerns about what's been spawned by the explosion of vaping in adolescent and youth populations, and their understanding of the shortcomings of the lack of regulation of these devices. So at the end of the day, there's a primum non nocere, in the first instance, do no harm maxim, which surrounds the use of these devices in smoking cessation. Slide, please. So one has to assess one's own professional vulnerability in advising these devices. And I think this slide also underscores some points that I've already made. Now, having said that, in complete transparency, if we could go back, please, there's no question that there are opportunities for clinical research in this area, and to be completely transparent, we're beginning some of that research in terms of trying to understand the concerns that motivate smokers to want to use these devices, and increasingly the concerns that motivate the users of these devices to want help in cessation with using these devices. And those are both clinical questions and clinical requests we're increasingly getting in our setting. And so our ability to help individuals stop vaping has triggered some explorations on our part, which hopefully will be launched in the near future. Slide, please. I think in many respects, we need to push the reset button in terms of the regulation of these devices. Again, I'm repeating what I've said earlier. Slide, please. And in my role I am currently chair of the Heart and Stroke Foundation, and the Heart and Stroke Foundation has relaunched in the last 2 weeks its campaign to encourage the federal government to introduce appropriate regulation of these devices so that their potential as cessation aids might be more clearly understood and might be capitalized upon, and also so that we protect young people, teenagers and adolescents from the epidemic that has been spawned by an industry that has no interest whatsoever in helping people stop smoking. And I would encourage all of you to use your clinical authority, if I can use that term, by clicking on that link, and adding your support as health professionals interested in smoking cessation with the Heart and Stroke Foundation's call for more appropriate regulation of these devices. With that, I'm going to conclude. I want to apologize for the technology problems which I've spawned. I want to thank Tanya for her help in making this presentation possible. And I look forward to further discussion as our program proceeds this morning.
Thank you, Dr. Pipe. I will turn it over to Rosemary, and Rosemary, I'll just go ahead and advance your slides. And you'll just have to unmute yourself.
There we go. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. When we were doing the planning way back last year, Cindy and I were talking about the different populations that we would be addressing in the webinar series. And my background has always been in harm reduction and substance use. So we wondered, we're starting to explore where that might fit with, and if it does fit with tobacco cessation and how e-cigarettes fit. So really, I'm just going to throw out some ideas, and I'd be very interested in getting our participants' comments on where they think e-cigarettes fit in a harm reduction strategy, or even a harm reduction strategy is applicable in a tobacco world. So I'm just going to go through a couple of frameworks for us to consider. And one of the things that is quite a challenge is synthesizing all the information. As Dr. Pipe has so eloquently articulated, there's a lot of research on e-cigarettes, and it's emerging all the time. And what do we do as clinicians in the here and now when we have people seeking our help? So I wanted to just let you know that when I deal with anyone who's got a tobacco addiction, I use a trauma-informed and harm reduction or harm minimization approach, and it's very much client-led, which I'm sure a lot of you apply these approaches as well. Next slide, please. So I wanted to highlight the Registered Nurses Association, and among other associations that have done a lot of work in trauma-informed care around tobacco use. And one of the things that resonates with me is that many of the people I see have had a lot of trauma in their life. And I really like the way the RNAO reflects on this. It's that trauma-informed care is a framework grounded in an understanding and a responsiveness to the impact of trauma without providing specific treatment for trauma. In other words, you don't need to be a trauma therapist, but really what you want to do is create opportunities for people to rebuild a sense of control and empowerment, and how that relates to their tobacco use. Now, why do we do that? Is because many of the people addicted to tobacco have a history of mental health issues, other addictions, life traumas, and tobacco is a key coping strategy for them. Therefore, it's paramount that the clients retain or regain a sense of control and empowerment in all aspects of their life, including their decisions related to tobacco use. So we really try to avoid the medical model as much as we can. Now, when we look at harm reduction, on the left is where I started in others working with substance users in harm reduction, and that's looking at reducing to a relative harm from a prior level. So trying to get them to cut back or using their drug in a different way that might be a little safer. Now, where this fits with tobacco, I'm not sure, because as we all know, tobacco, there are no safe limits of tobacco use. And so maybe harm minimization is the framework by which we can sort of look at working with people who are trying to quit tobacco. And that's because it strives to completely eliminate smoked tobacco and substituting it with something else. And that can be anything from nicotine replacement therapy, or do e-cigarettes also fit in that paradigm as well? Next slide, please. So I think we can all agree that, and as Dr. Pipe has outlined, and Cindy in her prior webinar, that youth and young adults should not be using e-cigarettes, nor should pregnant women or non-smoking populations like youth who've never picked up a cigarette in their life. Next slide, please. But where does it fit with people who are older adults, who have many years of smoking experience, who are highly addicted? They probably tried many times to quit, and they're seeking an alternative to tobacco. And this is the population that I work with the most. And within that population, I have had clients who have chosen to use e-cigarettes as a way to get off e-cigarettes to get off combustible cigarettes. Next slide, please. Now, I feel very overwhelmed sometimes by the amount of research that's coming out, fast and furious all the time. I know the latest Cochrane review that Dr. Pipe highlighted is showing that there's some evidence that e-cigarettes help, but I also recognize that there's going to be other research that shows there isn't much evidence to show that e-cigarettes help, and that there are better products out there to help people get off combustible tobacco. So is there a possibility of harm minimization and with the use of e-cigarettes? And where does dual use come in? Because oftentimes, as Dr. Pipe had also said, a lot of people use e-cigarettes in combination with tobacco, which is really defeating the purpose of getting off combustible tobacco. And there are concerns around the health effects of using both products. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about what I hear from tobacco users, and let's see where we can go with providing some support and counseling with them. Most of the clients that I hear from are really there seeking support. They're trying to figure out the best way to get off tobacco. They also have a lot of internalized stigma. I've had them tell me things like, I feel like a pariah in society. I feel like a failure because I'm the only one that hasn't quit yet in my family. And so what they really need from us is motivational support and not a lecture. They need a reason to try again and quit. So we really want to make sure that we are walking by their side and providing them with every motivation to take even one step towards getting off tobacco. Next slide, please. So one of the things we know is that a lot of people who smoke have tried using e-cigarettes to help them quit tobacco. And I think it's very important to include that you ask about e-cigarette use, past and present, when you build it into your assessments and your health record with clients. The other thing that I found is really helpful is to explore reasons for e-cigarette use. So we really start where the client is coming from. And in the true application of trauma-informed approach, you're going to ask permission to get information and to share information, both the pros and cons in their perspective. The other thing we need to do is if e-cigarettes have been identified by the client to stop smoking, we need to recognize and support motivation to quit tobacco and explore options for success that may for them include e-cigarettes. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I always start off with is I always ask what they like about e-cigarettes. It really helps me to understand what their motivations are and their experiences. I really liked this. This was a focus group done through the Ontario Tobacco Research Unit that looked at the voices of lived experience of participants in a convenience sample of 98 participants who had quit or had tried to quit smoking using vaping. And there were several themes that emerged that were reflective actually of what I've heard my own clients tell me. And you'll see that a lot of the themes for positive attributes is that they like that cigarettes actually help them feel more in control of their nicotine use. So when I vape, I can take as many or as few puffs as I want. So there's a lot about having control. The other area theme was positive outcomes. This theme reflects results that smokers experienced when they were vaping to quit. So they felt better. And relationships. I prefer vaping because I don't feel like I have the stigma of smoking. My family members prefer me vaping because of the health benefits. Next slide, please. So when I've explored what they like about e-cigarettes in the motivational interviewing style, we always ask what the negatives are about e-cigarettes. And in this study, a lot of the negative themes were related to the vaping devices themselves. There was a learning curve to vaping and finding what device worked best for me. And as Dr. Pipe was pointing out, new devices are coming out all the time. I find as a clinician, it's really hard to even keep up with all the different products that are out there. The other theme was around limitations to vaping. This theme reflects some experiences where vaping was an insufficient replacement for smoking a cigarette. So they felt like they were always using a vape to feel satisfied or to feel comfortable in getting enough nicotine. And the health concerns. So this theme included statements related to the health concerns about vaping and the negative physical outcomes with vaping. And this, of course, is often a jumping off point where we can have a more fulsome discussion with our patients who are using e-cigarettes. Next slide, please. So once we've explored the pros and cons of e-cigarettes with our clients, I always want to know what their intention is for their use. So I always ask what their overall goal for using e-cigarettes is. And I really want to listen for intention. So a lot of my clients will tell me, I want to get off cigarettes, or I want to reduce the number of cigarettes. Those are very common feedback that I get from clients. Less commonly, but maybe I'd be interested in the participants' experience as well. There's also, I use these e-cigarettes when I'm with my family to reduce secondhand smoke for them. So hidden in that, I think, is clients wish to continue smoking, but there are certain situations they can't, and they've actually done co-use using e-cigarettes where they can't smoke. So here are some of the emerging challenges for me and for our clients. As Dr. Pipe pointed out, a lot of the newer products have much higher levels of nicotine than they get from cigarettes. So that's where you're going to get some of the people complaining of feeling dizzy or feeling nauseated with it. And the new devices that are emerging regularly that it's hard to keep up with. And of course, they're not approved for cessation use in Canada. So that leaves a challenge for us as clinicians as to how do we best support people. The other thing we talk about with clients is the social and behavioral reinforcement that e-cigarettes provide. So they can often use e-cigarettes discreetly where they couldn't smoke, and the hand and mouth reinforcement, and of course the hit of nicotine that they get with some of the newer devices all reinforce the whole addictive behaviors. And because, just back one, research evolving, there's some challenges around keeping up with the latest research and what it means in practical terms with clients. And again, Dr. Pipe has mentioned that Big Tobacco is promoting e-cigarettes. And my concern is a lot of our clients are getting all of their information about e-cigarettes through the retailers that sell the e-cigarettes, and with very little information or critical thinking about what are the motivations for the information that they're getting from the retailers. And of course, the latest and greatest is what are the impacts of tobacco and e-cigarette users? And I've left some resources on that as well, because we're still doing studies on how COVID impacts our respiratory system if you're a tobacco users, and of course with an e-cigarette user as well. Next slide, please. So when we've determined their intention for use of e-cigarettes, I really try to tailor the response to each client based on what they're telling me. So for example, you said that you use e-cigarettes to try and reduce the number of cigarettes you smoke. It is commendable you're taking steps to reduce the harms of tobacco. What have you heard about the health concerns of using both e-cigarettes and cigarettes? May I share some information? And in this case, dual use is a concern. So maybe there's an opportunity for them to stop smoking and use e-cigarettes exclusively as an interim step. Next slide, please. But that means you don't stop there, because we do know that there are health concerns with e-cigarettes as well. So in our subsequent meetings, I usually revisit e-cigarette use and explore with them their experiences with it, and looking at other options to quit that are evidence-based and cost-free. And what I mean by that is often people who have used, for instance, nicotine replacement therapy before and weren't successful, I find that they weren't using it in appropriate doses, for example, and not titrating it to need. And so that they have sort of thrown that in the waste bin and said that it doesn't work. And so I like to kind of circle back to looking at other evidence-based and cost-free tools that they can use. And if it's cost-free, they're a little bit more likely to try it again. I also like to share what the emerging research says to help them make informed decisions. They are making the decisions for their health, and we need to have a robust conversation. And the main thing is to help them quit tobacco at every step. And that including the social and behavioral supports as well. Next slide. Because this is an emerging issue, as Dr. Pipe has pointed out, really we don't have a lot of best practice guidelines on how do we best help people who have chosen to use e-cigarettes and they continue to use e-cigarettes to quit. So here are a few things to keep in mind. They should be using products approved for sale, because we did see with products in the last few years, people making changes to or buying on the black market products that are, they're really not sure what they're getting. The other thing I find with older adults is they need to learn to use a device to deliver the appropriate amount of nicotine. So really titrating the nicotine levels. We want them to avoid dual use, and we definitely want them to avoid long-term use of e-cigarettes because of the lack of information on the long-term effects of e-cigarettes. Next slide, please. So really the key message to share is there's no magic cure for tobacco addiction. And a lot of people, when they've gone to vape shops to buy e-cigarettes, they think that it's going to be very helpful. And in some cases, it has been helpful, but in a lot of cases, it isn't. We need to ensure that they know that there are approved cessation aids that are available, that e-cigarettes are likely less harmful than cigarettes for adults, but they're definitely not harmless. And how less harmful they are, well, that remains to be seen. We want to make sure that stop smoking is a priority for them, that others should avoid secondhand vape, and they should really know how to use and take care of their vape device if they're going to be using it. Next slide, please. So my last slide is really putting out sort of a conversation around where do e-cigarettes actually fit. So we do have both the harm minimization philosophy, which is getting people off conventional cigarettes as fast as we can. But there's also a precautionary principle that any new product or policy should be resisted in the face of uncertain evidence. So can we use a harm minimization trauma-informed approach as well as apply the precautionary principle? Older adults using e-cigarettes in this way, they're using them whether we like it or not, so we need to be working with them. But it doesn't mean we should not pursue public health regulations and policies that protect other populations such as youth and young adults from the harms from e-cigarettes. However, there's no time to waste in helping all our clients avoid the deadly consequences of tobacco. And I'm going to leave it there. We can have a conversation with everyone.
Thank you, Rosemary. So we have some time for a Q&A. Participants can submit written questions by typing in the webinar chat box. I'm just giving a moment. All right, so we received one question. How do we support youth and adults who only vape or use e-cigarettes to quit?
Well, let me begin, if I may. First of all, let me say that I support virtually everything that Nancy has mentioned this morning. I think those are very, very important principles which should surround any approach to helping individuals with smoking. And I think how we can best help those who are trying to stop smoking or stop vaping is to apply those principles. To understand the implications that were so clearly presented to us in the last presentation. And it's, at the end of the day, smokers, they don't really care what you know. They just want to know that you care. And I think it's very, very important to ensure that we're reflecting the concern and the consideration, that we're not preachers, we're not lecturers, we're not authoritarian, that we really reflect that we understand how difficult smoking cessation can be, and that we're prepared to assist. In those who are using these devices, I would just echo what we already heard this morning, emphasize the sole use of these devices. Individuals who are using both devices do not get any significant reduction in risk, right? If you're smoking 4 to 5, 7 or 8 cigarettes a day, your risk of a myocardial infarction is 300% that of a non-smoker. And we fail to apprehend the risk that's represented by even minimal amounts of smoking. We also know that, and I think this is something that we haven't discussed this morning, individuals who may, because we know that most smokers come from lower socioeconomic situations or have significant psychiatric comorbidities, this constitutes an incredible expense for them. And I can see the situation where an individual who's smoking black market or contraband tobacco products because they can get those cheaply is now becoming addicted to the use or to the use of a device, which is being marketed by an industry which is now going to exploit them again. So that their exploitation, if you will, the exploitation of vulnerable populations may be compounded by the coincident use of vaping devices and continued smoking. So those are important considerations. I've gone on for far too long, so I'll stop and let Nancy respond.
Well, I think it looks like there's several questions regarding specific populations of youth and young adults, which I think is a different population than older adults who have come and are saying, I want to use e-cigarettes to help me get off tobacco. So I think they're apples and oranges a bit. And in terms of helping youth and young adults, part of the process, I'm sure Cindy and Dr. Pipe can comment on that, about regulations to make e-cigarettes much less attractive to young people, preventing their promotion. And we really don't know how to treat e-cigarette addiction yet. I think, Dr. Pipe, you were talking, this is something that people are going to be researching now, because we have a whole generation of young people using e-cigarettes who've never used a combustible cigarette in their life. So we're getting a whole new group of nicotine addicted people. Was that the question that was being asked around how do we support youth and adults? I'm going by the first question.
Yes, that was the first question. We've had
Mm-hmm.
some other ones come in. The next one was, is there a way that we can go to the government officials to have these products removed from Canadian shelves?
Well, I think that's going to be a very difficult challenge. The horses escape the barn, so to speak. It's interesting that, you know, Australia has prohibited these substances. New Zealand had and just recently allowed their use, but the products are much more thoughtfully regulated in that jurisdiction. I think what we have to do is to be emphatic in communicating to government, and it's Health Canada that should be the target of our concerns, of the need for the appropriate regulation of these devices. And the irony is that when these products become appropriately regulated and have known content, et cetera, then I think it's very appropriate to be using these to help individuals with smoking cessation. And you know, I think Rosemary and I are in total agreement in terms of the approaches that one might take, and have to be prepared to continue to argue for the appropriate regulation of these devices.
And it's not only the regulations. I think the actual user of e-cigarettes needs to understand that there aren't any real regulations here compared to other parts of the world where e-cigarettes are being used as a cessation device. As I said in my presentation, often people are getting information from their vape retailer store, and that's the only information they have. So definitely, I think there's a place for regulation, but also around people getting information that's going to be helpful to them when they're trying to make an informed decision about e-cigarettes. And I'm talking again about older adults. I think regulations need to happen to protect, as I said, a whole new generation of children and youth who are going to become addicted to nicotine through vaping instead. We don't need pina colada flavored e-cigarettes. I don't think that would be marketed to a 50-year-old person trying to quit smoking. So those flavorings in particular, but you showed us a picture of all the different types of little pods and flavorings that are very youth oriented. So I do think we need to be very conscious of what regulations need to happen, and we can definitely be advocating as health professionals for that. And Cindy, you may have a comment on that as well in your work.
I think you've both covered that fairly well, and there's a few more questions with very little time. So I'm wondering about, Is the flavor vaping dangerous? Many teens have damaged deadly the lungs. Do you have any comments about that?
There is absolutely no understanding of the impact of the flavored solutions, which when heated are inhaled and then delivered throughout the arterial system. And the other important element here is that there are literally thousands of chemicals that are used to make up the flavoring agents in these devices. There is no evidence at all of the impact of the various interactions that occur between and among these substances when they are heated. And so it's, I mean, it's astounding actually that as a consequence of the vacuum in our public health regulations, that you can administer intra-arterial drugs without any form of regulation whatsoever, because that's what's happening when you inhale cigarette smoke or inhale vaping smoke. And we lose sight of the fact this is not intravenous drug administration, this is intra-arterial drug administration. So those are very real concerns, which certainly our colleagues in respiratory physiology are very, very concerned about.
Great, we've got a couple more questions. Maybe we can get through one or two more. We have one question. Have you encountered using nicotine-free e-cigarettes as a means of harm reduction cessation? And two, how much nicotine is in a typical combustion cigarette in terms of helping calculate the e-cigarette nicotine content?
If I may, I'll jump in on that. So most people do not like using nicotine-free cigarettes or nicotine-free devices because individuals are seeking nicotine administration, which is one of the reasons why those approaches to smoking cessation have largely proven unsuccessful. The regulations in the United Kingdom say that they're basically 2% nicotine content in e-devices. Products that are being sold in Canada are 2, 3, 3.5, 4 times higher than those levels. And the individuals who go to the vape shop and are, may I call it, vaping hobbyists, those who take solutions, craft their own, increase the power of the battery so that they increase the temperature that vaporizes the solution, change the nature of the solution, they're getting substantial levels of God knows what in many instances, which is why Rosemary's advice about the advice that may be given in vaping retail establishments is very often highly suspect and not reliable at all. And I think that's where all of us involved in smoking cessation can provide reasoned advice about the use of these devices and the importance of being exclusive users and then getting off the use of these devices as well.
Thank you. We've got a couple more questions, lots of comments, questions. Just recognizing that our time is up. I'd like to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. And again, thank you to Dr. Pipe and Rosemary and to Cindy. Within the next day or so, you will receive an email with a link for an evaluation for today's webinar. Please fill in the survey. It'll assist us in evaluating the webinar and allow us to plan for future webinars. Upon completion of the evaluation, a link will be provided in which you can access a certificate of completion. The evaluation will close within a 2-week period. We hope that you will join us for upcoming webinars. For more information about the program and events, please visit RNAO. And thank you and have a wonderful afternoon.